It was brought to our attention that SHPO and the ASM needed better ways to educate different industries about the basic roles they play in archaeological reviews for projects. It came up that ranchers are afraid to report anything to these offices for fear of the consequences. I can say that until I joined the Wilcox-Sansomon NRCD board and began participating at the state level with the AACD, I knew very little about the archaeological clearance process. I had no idea that there was even an Arizona State Museum, or that if artifacts were found, tribal communities needed to be consulted. I've learned a lot since being on the NRCD and the AACD executive boards, but even more from discussing this webinar with Mary Ellen Walsh and from SHPO and Shannon Plummer from the ASM. Well, this webinar was initially intended for the agricultural industry. I think all industries will benefit from this presentation. At the end of the presentations, we will have a question and answer session. We ask that you keep your questions to a 2-minute time limit so that everyone can have a turn. Today's presenters will be Mary Ellen Walsh, Cultural Resources Compliance Manager with the State Historic Preservation Office. Shannon Plummer from Arizona Antiquities Act. She is the Arizona Antiquities Act Administrator, Arizona State Museum. Kristen Lucas. This is a hard word for me. Repatriation Coordinator, Arizona State Museum. Shane Anton, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. Angela Garcia Lewis, Cultural Preservation Compliance Supervisor, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. And who did I miss there?
I think you got us all.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you. All right, so we're ready for our presentation. And I thank you very much for being willing to do this, and we're happy to have you on this webinar.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And is it just showing the big one? No, it's showing everything.
Well, right now we got Deborah's, it's being recorded.
Well, is it showing the primary screen, or is it showing the side screens too?
It's showing the side screens.
How about now?
It's showing presenter view.
Okay.
Hold up, I can't remember.
Just hit play from start. There, that should, still showing presenter view. Sorry about that.
Okay.
If you go up to slideshow,
Yeah.
and then from beginning, you should be good. It should,
Yeah.
it's still showing presenter view.
Mhm. And now?
It's still in presenter mode.
All right, Shannon, why don't you do it?
Okay.
Save some time.
Can you give me the screen sharing ability, Tina?
Well, it's Deborah's got to do it.
Oh, Deborah, sorry.
Yeah. Mhm.
No, everybody, yes, you have the availability to share your screen.
Oh, great, thanks. Give me 1 second.
And Deborah, somehow you need to get that recording thing down.
I think if you click on it, it might just go away.
We're already recording. We're good.
I know, but it's saying that it's recording. There's a little note up there. Oh, maybe
That's
it's
your own
me.
screen. You just click on it.
Okay, that's on me. Okay. Everybody say got it on there.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Is it doing the same thing now?
Now I've got you. It looks good on my end.
Okay, just making sure I'm sharing the right screen here.
And this is the final one, correct? Yeah. Okay, I'll start off. Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to thank AACD for having us here today. One objective of this presentation is to give you the background, the context for our roles in your projects, whether they're on state or federal land or even private land. We want to demystify who we are, what we do, and why we do it. We also want to hear and address your questions and concerns. I spent some time a few years ago meeting with ranchers at various places around the state to better understand the types of activities you conduct on a regular basis and the machinery you use. We use that information to develop an agreement document for Natural Resources Conservation Service, and later a statewide vegetation and rangeland management agreement for the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, and other agencies that identifies the types of activities that don't require survey or individual consultation with SHPO. Later, we worked with the State Museum to address how certain types of sites would now be recorded, which reduces fieldwork and reporting time and ultimately cost. We already have guidance in place that results in streamlined reporting and to address when survey is not necessary because the area has been surveyed to current standards. What you generally don't hear is the tribal perspective, which is or should be included in all consultation, but at the government to government level of interaction, and it's on a tribe by tribe basis. So you'll hear from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community today as well, one of the 22 federally recognized tribes with ancestral ties in Arizona. Okay, slide 2.
Just 1 second, I'm having technical difficulties here. There we go. Are you seeing just the slideshow now on your screens? Oh, for the love of Pete. How about now?
Did something. Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Show we're archaeologists and not IT people. Oh,
Okay, so slide 2, please.
there you go.
So Shannon, Kristen, and I will take time to discuss some of the state and federal statutes. And we'd like you to remember that SHPO and ASM are 2 distinct entities with completely different responsibilities. When it comes to consultation, we've been doing our best to educate agencies to consult with our offices consecutively to help with the time problems that we've often seen. And we will go into the next slide, please. I'll briefly discuss today the National Historic Preservation Act and the State Historic Preservation Act. Shannon and Kristen will talk about the Arizona Antiquities Act.
And ARIS 41860.
And
which is
right,
separate.
and it doesn't have a regular name.
No,
So we're including all these statutes up on in your PowerPoint, which you can all have access to. So if you want to look at anything further, you know where to look. Next slide, please. This slide just summarizes the various activities each of our offices are involved in. Overlap is report review, but even then we're looking at reports somewhat differently. SHPO's responsibilities are outlined in Section 106 regulations and the State Historic Preservation Act. But the thing to know is that we have collaborated sufficiently with the ASM, so one report should meet all our needs. We just have to gather different information from it because SHPO looks for things like determinations of eligibility that ASM has no role in. And Shannon will talk about what their roles are separately. Okay, next slide. So National Historic Preservation Act was established in 1966 and it's gone through several amendments. And it requires that federal agencies take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. An undertaking is any project using federal money, requiring federal permits, or is located on federal land. So for ranchers, any project that goes through NRCS or rural development for funding, your project is a federal undertaking. And in many cases, it will be reviewed by our office or not, because we now have the NRCS agreement document in place. And we do what's called the batch consultation. I'm not going to go into the weeds of what the acts are and all that. I think we'd rather have a more robust discussion with you at the end about different types of activities that we do. I just want to lay it all out here to give you the backbone of our roles and responsibilities. So historic properties is a word, a phrase from the National Register bulletin, it's defined there, that are cultural resources that are determined to be eligible for inclusion in or have been listed in the National Register. Cultural resource, these are sites, districts, structures, objects, sites, districts, objects, one more. And buildings and structures, sites, districts, and objects. So if they have been determined eligible, then they are considered historic properties. And it gets confusing at times because we also talk about historic buildings, and the language is sometimes confusing. But when we are talking about section 106, historic properties has a specific meaning. That's important to know. Next slide, please. So section 106 is a process. It doesn't have a defined outcome. We go through different steps, or the federal agency goes through the steps of the process. SHPO's role is to ensure that either there's an agreement document in place that wherein the agency does not have to consult with our office on certain kinds of activities, or that they do consult and we have the opportunity to comment on whether or not the undertaking is defined sufficiently, whether what's called the area of potential effects is identified adequately. And that is not just a project area. The APE, as it's called, is the geographic area that in which we have to look for the indirect and cumulative effects of the undertaking on historic properties. So it can be wider than a general project area, or it can be narrower. Most often it's wider because we're looking at historic properties also include traditional cultural properties or places, and they are often visually distinct, like mountains, and Sean and Angela will get into that. And a project in your little location might have an effect on the use of the area by Native Americans. So there's a lot that goes into determining whether the area of potential effects is sufficient. So the agency coordinates and identifies the consulting parties. The SHPO helps to identify consulting parties that they might have missed. At any time, you as part of the Cattle Growers Association or as individuals in the public sector, you can be a consulting party upon request. So you just have to contact the lead federal agency. And there always has to be a plan to involve the public. That generally depends on the nature and scope of the project. So the first thing the agency lead will do is determine whether or not the undertaking has the potential to affect historic properties. If the answer is no, section 106 is done at that point. If the answer is yes, we move on to the next stage, and the agency, again, has to hire a consultant or use its team of archaeologists to identify historic properties using a combination of research methods and intensive or sampling survey in the field. There's what's called a reasonable and good faith effort to identify historic properties. This means that if there is a 10,000 acre survey, not every acre of that 10,000 acres needs to be surveyed. If there's enough information from the surrounding landscape, we rely on that to determine whether or not a sample survey is necessary. When a sample survey is conducted, it's relying on the background research, the landforms, what's known about the sites in the area. So oftentimes there is sufficient information to not have to do a full survey. And we encourage agencies to remember that, and they really are starting to these days. They do have specific reasons why 100% survey is necessary. That's beyond section 106. That is an agency determination. Next, the consultants, and in their survey, they will document any sites and other resources that are found during their survey and make recommendations on eligibility for inclusion in the National Register, significance in an appropriate historic context, and whether or not it retains aspects of integrity. its association, feeling, design, workmanship, location. There are 7 aspects. And with archaeological sites, it's often limited to 2 or 3 of these aspects of integrity because of the nature of the sites, but that's all part of the determination that the agency uses. And then they consult with SHPO. Do we agree? And when we look at reports, we have been requesting that there's sufficient information in the site description, which contains information about the landform, the topography, proximity to water, the types of features, number of features, and artifacts and such on the site. And then what's the context in which it's significant? What's the period of significance? For prehistoric cultures in the area, we talk about archaeological phases, and there's a general time frame for those. And basically, we want to hear something about not just the prehistoric landscape, settlement patterns, but we want to know more specifically, what about that is significant, because the entire country was occupied prehistorically, or pre-contact. So we want to know what's significant. Usually it's at the local level, but that's fine for National Register eligibility. So we consult and we provide our concurrence or not on determinations of eligibility. If there are no historic properties affected by the undertaking, meaning that they are maybe present, but they're not going to be affected, or they are present but not eligible for the register, we move on to the next phase, and that's assessing the adverse effects. So there's, in the stipulations for Section 106, there's a clause where you apply the criteria of adverse effects. If there are no adverse effects, then consultation is done. If there are adverse effects, we continue consultation with the development of an agreement document and do our best to mitigate responsibly, practically, feasibly, the adverse effects of the undertaking to historic properties. Now, we have problems not just in Arizona, where these considerations need to be done early in the project so we can have meaningful consultation with all the consulting parties and especially tribes. We don't speak for tribes in our role as SHPO. Tribes have their own values and perspectives. So in our consultation, if we haven't heard from the tribes, we will keep that open and say, if a tribe disagrees with your findings, we reserve the right to keep consultation open again or reopen it. And we try to hear from tribes before answering. We only have 30 days for our review in statute, so sometimes that's limited. Tribes don't have any statute requirement, to my knowledge. So that last part is resolving the adverse effect through the mitigation and all. So when all that is done, and it does take some time, if you have an adverse effect on a historic property, yes, there is a time delay to a project that's supposed to happen. It involves sometimes just archival research, which will not affect the construction start time of the project. Often it will involve data recovery, field excavation. Sometimes we'll put into agreements that as long as the work is limited to one area of the project, that construction can start in another area. It's a construction variance. When we don't have projects that adversely affect historic properties, the timeline should be much smoother. What we're doing, you may not know it, especially from the private sector. So for these NRCS applications, for example, you've submitted your application to NRCS and goes through a process of ranking. Then NRCS has to either do the survey or hire somebody to do the survey. The report gets sent back to them first. And it could sit there because of other responsibilities that are going on. For SHPO's responsibility, when we get that report, and it could be 6 months to a year down the road, and we've had reports sitting on the Corps of Engineers desk for years before we see them, then that's when our consultation clock begins. And that's 30 days, 30 calendar days. So if you think that we are sitting on a project, you should always call, because I can show you when something comes in with a stamped date, or I can tell you that we have not received anything yet, and it's probably still in the hands of the agency. We work independently from them. We can only do our reviews after their review is complete. So the project can proceed with, again, with projects for NRCS, they do a lot of avoidance of sites, and that's really important. They will be out in the field. We've worked with NRCS to develop practices where they go by and do an alternate route survey for linear projects, so they don't have to go back and forth from field to office to field again with our consultation on a site, because we know that they're going to avoid the site as much as possible. So that's the main thing for NRCS projects. This is basically how the Section 106 review process works. As I said, when we're talking about survey projects with no sites or no impacts, you're still looking at several months of review, because not only do we review it, but it could go back and forth with comments for the report, and tribal consultation and other consulting parties have the right to review the documents. Next slide, please. So the state, I'm going to just leave that there for the Section 106. There's a lot more to it that we could get into in a 8-hour course. This isn't the place for it. I'm just, again, trying to give you the background of why we do what we do. The State Historic Preservation Act says that agency programs must establish a program to locate, inventory, and nominate to the Arizona Register of Historic Places all properties under the agency's ownership. Basically, Arizona's State Act follows the National Historic Preservation Act and how we implement it. It doesn't have the teeth of the NHPA, where there is no resolution of adverse effects. We can make recommendations, and most state agencies, like federal agencies, will comply with recommendations to avoid significant impacts to archaeological sites. Sometimes it doesn't happen. And then there are things that we do to address those circumstances when disturbances happen that shouldn't. And that's usually in ASM's wheelhouse, not in SHPO's. We get notified ASM has the teeth on those kinds of activities. But basically, there's an Arizona register. It has legacy data where it's only relative to Arizona, not a national significance. Most everything else that's listed for the Arizona register has national significance as well in our interpretation of it. Next slide. So also part of the State Act are records and documentation standards. This requires the agencies to consult with the SHPO to make the appropriate recommendation on how to proceed with the project, especially in terms of demolition or reuse of historic buildings. That's a big one with the state. And it's probably going to be a bigger one now that the state has minimized its physical space into a few buildings. And now we have a lot of historic buildings that are actually available for use. And then we go from there until what the documentation standards are from SHPO's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, we have guidance points and other documents that help the consultants write the reports that meets our standards and ASM standards. And for the State Historic Preservation Act consultation, we also have 30 days to review these plans or reports. Next. So my role for SHPO in sum, we provide technical assistance and educational opportunities for State Act and Section 106 consultation and compliance. We ensure the consultation process is followed. We're neutral. The SHPO is appointed by the governor of Arizona. So his constituents are her constituents. So she wants to hear from cattle ranchers, and we have, like I said, gone out and done meetings We've done a few meetings with NOCD and Flagstaff, their annual meetings. It's been really good for us to meet people. But our main goal is to ensure the consultation process is followed. Again, we have 30 days to complete our reviews. We often do them less than 15. We coordinate and collaborate with agencies, tribes, and other consulting parties to find satisfactory resolutions to adverse effects. And we provide consultants with guidance for when survey is necessary and for streamlined reporting. We do not stop projects. I can't repeat that enough because I know that when I've talked to people one-on-one, a lot of times it's just misinformation about where the project is sitting, that maybe it hasn't come to our office yet. It's not to say that bad decisions haven't been made in the past. I went to a site with one of the ranchers up north, and what the previous archaeologist consultant had told them about what was necessary made them stop a project. It was wrong. Anytime you as a rancher hears that from a consultant that you should not do this project because, you should ask for a meeting with the federal agency and with SHPO so that we can better understand the project and work out a solution for you. There should never be a time when your project is stopped on our end. There may be other factors out of our control, but our position is to help you find the way to get your project moving forward through the consultation process. I think that's all I have. Shannon?
Hi, so I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the Arizona Antiquities Act, and that's comprised of ARS 15-1631, as well as 41-841 through 844. And on the screen is just the basic text directly from the acts, but the quick and dirty version is 15-1631 basically establishes the Arizona State Museum. So we're mandated to exist. And as part of our mandate is to protect cultural resources on state lands. And in the Arizona Antiquities Act, state lands is defined as any lands owned or controlled by this state, by any public agency or institution of the state, or by any county or municipal corporation within the state. So basically, if you're on lands owned by a city, a county, or the state itself, then you're obligated to comply with the Arizona Antiquities Act. And to do so, as in 841, you need a permit. 842, to get a permit, you have to be a professional archaeologist. 843, you can't damage a site or conduct any sort of archaeological research without a permit. And 844, you have a duty to report archaeological findings, cultural resources, if you identify them. And that includes human remains, funerary objects, sacred ceremonial objects, and objects of national or tribal patrimony. And just to reiterate, this is the state land encompasses all of those types of land that I described. If no state land is involved, then the Arizona Antiquities Act does not apply. You may have other regulations to follow, local ordinances, state laws, federal laws, but the ASM does not need to be involved. And just as a FYI, there are repercussions for violating the Arizona Antiquities Act that they're written into state criminal code 13-3702. And they range from misdemeanors through class 3 felonies, depending on the type of infraction and whether or not the offender has previously done a similar offense. So just for background. Next one. Okay, I'm going to let Kristen take this one.
Okay, I just wanted to make another couple of quick points on ARS 41-844. So as Shannon already touched on, this statute provides for protection for human remains, funerary objects, sacred ceremonial objects, and objects of national and tribal patrimony that are 50 years or older. And so I wanted to clarify what was meant by human remains that are 50 years or older. So that's anything that's been deposited for more than 50 years, And this isn't pertaining specifically to Native American remains. It actually applies to all communities of human remains that were deposited 50 plus years. And then the statute also further specifies that ASM shall respond to every report of discovery in a timely fashion. The other statute, Shannon, if you could switch the slide, thank you, is it pertains to private land. So this is ARS 41-865. And this statute requires that a person cannot intentionally disturb human remains or funerary objects, again, that are 50 years or more, without written permission from ASM. And so note here that there's a difference where it is on state land, there are more cultural objects that are afforded protection, whereas on private land, the only things that are afforded protection are human remains and funerary objects. Any person who intentionally sells, possesses, or transfers human remains or funerary objects that were removed in violation of the statute pertaining to private land is guilty of a Class 5 felony. Additionally, unintentional disturbances of human remains and funerary objects also need to be reported to ASM, and further disturbance cannot take place without written permission from us. And just as another side note, any person who disturbs human remains or funerary objects on private land and fails to report that disturbance is guilty of a Class 1 misdemeanor. This statute further specifies that ASM is mandated to respond in a prompt manner and that we must respond to all notifications within 10 working days. Another requisite of this statute is that ASM will arrange for the appropriate disposition of the remains and funerary objects in consultation with appropriate parties. This means that we work with descendant communities and landowners to determine the most culturally appropriate and respectful outcome that ensures the future safety of the remains. And so this can mean reburying the remains in place if that's deemed appropriate. It can also mean exhuming the remains to be reburied in a nearby or another location entirely. And this is something that comes from consultation. Both statutes, both 41-844 and 41-865, express a duty to report discoveries. So let's talk about what happens when remains are encountered. First, the landowner or archaeological contractor who they're working with will report by email or phone any encountered remains or other protected classes of cultural objects. And then we will work with the notifier to ensure that the work in the immediate area of the discovery is temporarily ceased and that the remains are protected. On that note, I want to make sure that it's clear that the work in the area of the discovery needs to close, but work in other areas of the property can continue. Additionally, ASM will notify all groups who have cultural and or religious affinity, a geographic affinity, or a kinship relationship with the remains or cultural items as is appropriate. And in consultation with appropriate parties, we will arrange for the appropriate disposition of the remains and or cultural items to ensure that they are cared for and so that work may continue as planned without lengthy delays. Both statutes also indicate that ASM must respond promptly and that consultations regarding disturbed remains should not be unreasonably delayed. So a way to efficiently implement these statutes without causing delays, ASM is afforded an ability to enter into agreements with landowners or archaeological contractors and descendant communities as a way to help ensure that remains are treated with respect and dignity and to mitigate any sort of delays that might happen. So these agreements basically outline the procedures for what should happen if remains are encountered, and they're negotiated prior to a project beginning. And we can get into a lot of details about this, but I'm not going to do that today. If you have any questions about that or want more information, there is information online on ASM-CRM's website, and I can provide a link for that later if someone's interested. But that's not the point of right now. So the last thing that I want to say is that these statutes seek to provide for the respectful treatment of all human remains that are laid to rest 50 years or more, and to ensure that they receive the same dignity we would provide a loved one today. The statutes are not put in place specifically to cause long delays to work or to attempt to create hurdles for anyone. In the end, it's about making the process as clear and easy as possible to ensure that all encountered remains are treated respectfully and that landowners are able to carry out their work as planned. And if you ever have any questions about these or the other Arizona Antiquities Act statutes, please feel free to reach out to either Shannon or I, because we're very happy to assist anyone. We love it when people approach us with questions. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of what is involved in ASM's mandate. We, in addition to working on the treatment plans, or sorry, permitting and that sort of thing, our mandate covers, we've grouped it into 4 basic realms, and it's divided into 4 different offices, each with its own manager and focus. So the Archaeological Permits Office reviews permit applications, associated treatment plans, and reports, as well as the people who are going to be listed on the permit. The Archaeological Records Office is there to house all of the site cards for sites identified on state lands in Arizona. Per ARS 39-125, that information is considered confidential and made available only to professional archaeologists. So the information can be passed along to private citizens, but it is done so via the involvement of a professional archaeologist. So the most common way that is done is if a project is going to be conducted, let's say putting in a fence line, an archaeologist, a professional consultant would most likely be the one to come out that was hired by the landowner or whoever is providing the overall funding for the project. They would conduct a survey, which is just walking the ground to see if they can see any evidence of an archaeological site. And if they do find one, then they record that information, they record the site and submit it to the Archaeological Records Office. Then that is made available to other archaeologists. And the information regarding that project and previous sites in the area is provided in the form of a report and a distilled version of what is there is made available to the non-archaeological people involved in the project itself. We have an archaeological repository, which is the official repository for collections from state lands. There are other repositories in the state and they are allowed to curate materials from state lands, but they do need to meet a certain minimum set of requirements that are laid out in what we call the rules implementing the Arizona Antiquities Act. So we've got the set of statutes that defines what the Arizona Antiquities Act is, and those are operationalized in the rules implementing the Arizona Antiquities Act, which is a considerably more lengthy and detailed list of guidelines that's published by the Arizona Board of Regents. And lastly, the Repatriation Office, which is where Kristen works, and she just discussed the responsibilities that they handle in their office. So it's kind of a team approach to making sure our mandate is properly carried out. So just as a quick overview, what we were just saying, we ensure ASM ensures compliance with the Arizona Antiquities Act, issue permits, we review reports and treatment plans, we review credentials, we hold on to site records, we curate all the artifacts from state lands, respond to disturbances of human remains, issue burial discovery agreements, and we serve as the point of contact for the reporting of any archaeological, paleontological, or human remains encounters on state lands. And that's not just by archaeologists, any citizen, if one identifies archaeological remains or any of these types of remains on state lands, there is, as mentioned in the 844, that duty to report that duty is held by all Arizonans. So there is information on our website. And again, one of us, maybe Kristen, would you mind copying and pasting the list or the CRM portion of ASM's website into the comments? But all you need to do if you find something is give me a call. If it's not human remains related, and if it is, give Kristen a call. We ask that you can pick up the object and look at it as long as it's not human remains, but otherwise leave it in place, please, because once it's removed, then it loses a considerable amount of the information associated with the object, because provenience, landscape, location, all of that is just as important to the data, the information associated with an object as the object itself. And just summarizing our goals, we do our best to work in partnership with other agencies, the cultural resources management, the private consulting firms in the state of Arizona, Arizona's tribes, and the constituents like yourselves. We work to educate archaeologists and the public about the AAA and 41865 and why they're important. We don't have a mandated turnaround time for anything other than permit applications, but our goal is to get all of our reviews done in 30 days or less. We try to develop policies and procedures for efficient and effective archaeological research, and that is often done in consultation with our partners to make sure as many concerns as possible are identified and addressed in those policies and procedures. And as I'd like to reiterate what Mary Ellen and Kristen have said, the identification of cultural resources does not equate a cancellation of your project. It simply means that additional measures may need to be taken to ensure that that resource is protected and you are in compliance with state and federal laws. And that is for everyone's protection. And we are here to assist you with that. So if you have questions, as it's been said, just give us a call. And then I'm going to also quickly touch base on ASSITE, just for your reference. It is an online cultural resources inventory that it's a GIS database, which contains both like data about the sites as well as spatial data of the locations of sites in a single location. It is managed by the ASM, the State Historic Preservation Office, the Museum of Northern Arizona, and Arizona State University. Each organization contributes data to the overall database. ASM puts in information about the sites and surveys on state lands, and SHPO puts in information about National Register of Historic Places information. There is an advisory committee which provides feedback to the ASSITE board. It is only available to professional archaeologists, tribes, and agencies for the confidentiality reason that we discussed earlier. And to gain access to the data, there is a fee.
I could just add, I thought I corrected this. We opened it up to local municipalities this year for the first time.
Oh, okay, that's right.
The needs for planning purposes.
Awesome.
So that's been a big help from what I understand. And there will be training to go along with that for anybody that's not an archaeologist.
Thanks, Mary Ellen. Do you want to take this one, Mary Ellen? You kind of created the slide.
Right. We just wanted to give you an idea of what's done to get the project through our office. So there's a lot of field work. There's research to identify known sites and determine the need for survey. As public entity or private firm, you would hire an archaeological consultants, schedule for field survey. These are the things that address your time for the project to begin. The survey report, once the survey is done, needs to be prepared and submitted to the agency for review. Then the agency submits it to SHPO and ASM for concurrent review. And then the agency also consults separately with tribes. And that review time may be longer than it is for SHPO and ASM because the tribes have to go possibly through not just their historic preservation office, but the councils or the government. And the project registration fees and curation costs to ASM if the project is conducted under a AAA permit. And I know there was a lot of discussion over the years. There have been things done to minimize whether or not a survey is necessary, the guidance points. And we equip private developers with as much knowledge as we can so they know to ask whether or not, if they're told the idea that an area has been surveyed and surveyed numerous times over is not really true. We need to have some record of that survey, and we need to make sure it meets current standards, and that changes with how a site is defined. The survey transect intervals, primarily, those two things. That's a huge factor in determining whether or not a survey is necessary or what cost is going to be increased or not. Do you need a sample survey? It's a large project. We often recommend sample surveys, but it's not our call unless somebody comes to us and the agency comes to us and says a sample survey is requested, then we work with them to develop a suitable sample. When we have surveys that are negative, we have streamlined reporting. And we're now working with ASM, who has developed streamlined reporting for negative monitoring projects.
We're working on it. We're almost there.
We're almost
by
there,
the end
but,
of the year.
We work together on these things to help everybody out and reduce time and costs.
Yeah, and just in relation to that, so SHPO does that batch consultation, but ASM does not, because we need to review each survey on its own. It's treated with its own accession number and report. And I just wanted to touch base on the fees. That is a common question we get. We do need to charge fees for our services. It is in the Arizona Antiquities Act. Actually, it's in the rules implementing the Arizona Antiquities Act that we must recoup the costs associated for our labor and curation costs. And the reason that is done is because, as I've mentioned several times, we're mandated to exist. So we're legally obligated to exist. If we closed our doors, we'd be breaking the law. However, we get zero state funding. So the only way we can carry out our mandate is to charge fees. And we expect that what happens is the archaeologist who is doing the work bills our fees to whoever has hired them. So it gets passed on that way.
So these are some items that we've identified. This is more for consultants than for the ranchers here, but the things that will delay the project possibly to some extent. Sometimes we will go ahead and say there's no adverse effect, but we have comments. So the project in one hand can move forward, but we're expecting the consultant to address comments in a report for several issues. One that I mentioned earlier is that the area of potential effects is not adequately defined. This is specifically for federal undertakings. There's inadequate survey or field methods, or there's not enough research being done. Doesn't happen that often. Failure to adequately consult with tribes regarding traditional cultural properties, sacred sites, and traditional use areas. This is on the agency. We ask them of concerns at SHPO, do tribes have any concerns? That's our way of saying, did you actually consult with tribes? So we know that the consultation is done. And if a report doesn't meet what we're calling the minimum standards that are identified in our joint documents and the rules implemented for AAA. This one, we kind of had fun with it initially. It seems a little bit crazy when you look at it. These are the consultation nexus. So federal land, in case you need to know what authorities are being invoked for, it's triggering consultation with our office, or for review under the Antiquities Act. That's what this table shows. And there's a color code. SHPO is in green, ASM is in blue, and both SHPO and ASM reviews or actions are in purple. So it's just a quick look at a reminder that if you have a federal undertaking, and that would be federal funds or state action, state funds, state land, federal land, you could look at this in different ways to identify what kind of consultation is necessary.
Okay, and now I'm going to pass it over to Shane and Angela.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry, we were doing rock, paper, scissors to see who went first. But thank you for that. And so we're going to go into our consultation or our presentation regarding this, and I appreciate your guys' review of what ASM and SHPO does. So our mandates are similar to the SHPO. We're the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. We deal mostly with federal projects, but we do also deal with state projects and state lands. And so it's important. We also always want to provide information about who we are and that we exist for, as hard as it is to believe, some municipalities or organizations don't even know that there are still current tribes that exist. We haven't all disappeared or been diminished or wiped out, or we've have a strong historical sense, prehistorical sense here in the state of Arizona. And so you may know us as the Pima and Maricopa, and those are given names. Those are not the names that we call ourselves. So in the slide that you see there, the top word there with the O, apostrophe O, was pronounced autumn. Autumn. You don't read it in English. We have our own orthographies, and the second word is pipash, pipash. And so those words literally translated just means the people. So prior to contact, prior to any other people in the area, when we refer to ourselves, we spoke in our own languages. And so the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community is one tribe recognized federally, but we're a confederation of two tribes, an alliance of two tribes that are not related by blood or kinship. So there's two separate and distinct languages, beliefs, customs, and culture about it. So in the top, you'll see some historical photos of the Autumn, or what is known as the Pima. And the bottom, there's the Pipash, or photos of the Pipash, or what is known as the Maricopa. And so for our community today, it's called the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. Again, that's because we are two different and distinct tribal entities.
Just let me know you want me to switch slides.
Oh, I muted myself on yeah, next slide, please.
Okay.
And so a lot of times people, again, too, are just kind of, there's a lot to our relationship with the land or the area. There's a lot of to our relationship with the world. And so I think one of the first things that people think about And I'm going to kind of go and describe these pictures in a counterclockwise circular motion. So at the top there, the top bubble, those are archaeological resources. So those are pots and some different things that we have, a matati and a grinding stone. Those are the tools that we used, the things that we did, and how we survived on the landscape. And so those places are still important to us, or those things that survived within the landscape are important to us. They're a better part of the evidence that we still exist and that we're here and that we did these things for millennia, you know, and our creation stories and our beliefs, we've been here since time immemorial. We're not immigrants from anywhere else. We've been here, and again, continued occupation for the since time immemorial. We're all over Southern Arizona, our specific tribes. And so that includes a lot of areas that you have where you have your cattle ranches and where you now exist or where you do your business. And so the second bubble to the left is a ceremonial site. So like any other culture or peoples, we had our religion, we had our beliefs, we had our sacred areas that we did what we needed to religiously, culturally, and so those sites still exist. They may not be understood by somebody who is not O'odham or Pipash, or they may not understand the significance of the area and how we used it and why it's significant. The picture to the far left with the young ladies with sticks, they're playing a game called Taka, and it's something like a field hockey game, but it's gender specific. It's only for the females. They do it, and it's a pretty brutal game. So again, understanding in our daily lives that we had games, we did other things, we had religion, we had to hunt and gather. We did a lot, raise families. And so there's a lot involved, again, with the landscape and how we survived on and some of the things that we used and what the things that are important to us. The two bottom pictures to the left with the pottery and the one with the cactus. So those are gathering sites or what we needed. So the Pipash people are now more known, although both tribes did it, made pottery and are not well known for their pottery. And so we didn't import stuff from far away or not too far away. So everything was used by local resources. So those places that exist where we have the resources, you know, we needed clay to make pots. So there aren't a lot of clay deposits everywhere, but they exist. And so for us to continue our culture and to do things, we have to protect those sites that have the clay, that we have to have access to those sites. So those are important to us and in consultation. And so when we work with you and we talk with you, we want to make sure like, hey, are there clay sites? Are there resource sites that we may want or need? And going to the picture with the in the cactus, I don't know how fine you can see it, but there's a lady, she's got a, Angela, help me out. What's the word? Quickfoot. She's pulling down the fruit from the saguaro, and they use that to make candy and a syrup and wine, many different things that we use that for. And again, but we survived off the landscape. And so there's a certain time of season, things that we do, and there's traditional stories. And I'm not sure if their songs are associated with that, but there's much more than just getting the resource. Going up the other half of the chain, I'm going to turn it over to Angela, and she can tell you what those bubbles represent.
Okay. All right.
You got to turn down your, this, you can, we got two speakers on, sorry.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Can you guys hear her?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, so the photo on the bottom is creosote. What everyone knows is chaparral, or, you know, and it's very common. You see it all over the place. You probably have some in your yard right now. And that's one of the things that we consider to be a sacred plant. It was, you know, given to us by our creator. We use it for everything from burials to baptisms and from medicinal purposes and blessings. So even though it is considered something that is common, we still consider it to be special. And that is, even though it's pervasive on the landscape, we still like to try to protect this often as we can. And then we have rattlesnakes and, you know, sacred animal habitat. So with sacred animal habitat, we have, you know, rattlesnakes that you find everywhere and that are fairly common. They're not endangered or anything like that. And you have eagles, and the desert nesting bald eagle is no longer listed on the Endangered Species Act, but it still is very rare. But it doesn't matter whether or not the eagles are plentiful or very rare. They're still considered important to our cultures and our religions. And so we look out for the habitat, because the habitat is still important whether or not the resource is plentiful. Any place that we have standing water, so you see the wildcat, the mountain lion drinking water from this tanaha. A tanaha is a depression in the rock. So it's not man-made, it's not some like, it's not a river, it's not a lake, it's nothing like that, but it collects water during the monsoon season. So any place that collects water is important, because here, living in the desert, we're highly aware of the necessity of water. And then finally, we have the places that are mentioned in our creation stories. So a lot of those places are mountains. A lot of those places are landforms, and they're important to us because they're tied specifically to our creation stories and to our song culture. And those are the ways that we capture our history and our culture, and we tell those stories every year to pass those ideals down from one generation to the next. So all of these things that we're talking about right now, all of these traditional cultural resources are things that we still do, that we still use, and represent the last vestiges of our cultures. So it seems like there are a lot of resources, but in actuality, they're very few. And so we try very, very hard to save what's left, because we don't control a lot of our ancestral territory. So we're extremely grateful that there are laws that protect these types of things, and that there are a lot of people like you all who are out there and invested in protecting resources because of those laws. Go ahead.
Next slide, please.
So when we say that we're oral history cultures, that means that we don't pass things down by writing them down. So we're not writing books about our history, because in our traditional culture, it's important to meet face to face and to tell each generation what's important to us. And that's a major difference between our cultures and modern culture, because as you can see, this photo here is a picture of the Sanavir mission. It's just one of the examples we wanted to share with you. So when we look at the mission, you can obviously tell that it's an important building. It's, very rich with history. It's important to a lot of different people. So on the bottom left bubble, you see that they're not the nation. So anytime you go out there, you can see them, that there are vendors there from the nation, and all of that. They are still present there. That's where they go to church. that's, there's a mission school there, their children go to school there. The mission is on Thonottam Nation land. But one thing that another part of history that people don't really think about is that the Spanish missionaries didn't come with their own construction crews. So the O'odham people actually helped construct the building. So it's steeped in the history of the people, right? The next bubble is the city of Tucson. It's important to the city of Tucson because it's one of the ways that they generate interest in their town. And it's a hot spot for tourism for them. The bubble in the middle is the Tucson Catholic Diocese. So it is an active working church, and people do attend from that congregation. So it's a part of that church. It brings in, what do you call them? Donations from the church, and the tourism helps with that. It's important to the state of Arizona because it marks a point in time in history when Spanish colonialization started. It's when the Europeans started coming to this area in the 1500s, and it marks a particular time in history. It marks a particular type of architecture. It marks the beginning of written history in this area. And it's important to the Catholic Church because it's one of the ways that shows their type of faith, what they do, the fact that they send missionaries out to different places to colonize. And it's one of the first forays in their particular history into the New World. So all of those ways are important, and it shows how that particular building impacts all of these numerous different places. And it's rich with history. But if it were to burn down, that would be a really terrible, it would be, a disaster. Next slide, please. But the difference between a written culture and an oral history culture is that this particular building is important to the nation still. But it is, the mission itself has been memorialized in several different books, from different photo essay type books to history books. So a majority of its history would not be lost. One of the things that a lot of people don't know is that the Santa Fe mission is built on top of an O'odham sacred site. So the little hill in the background is actually a traditional cultural property for the O'odham. If the mission of Santa Fe del Bac were to burn down, the city of Tucson would still remain. The Tucson Diocese has hundreds of other churches within their group. Tourism in Arizona and the Arizona history would not be lost because there are other missions here that are still standing and are associated with that particular time and architecture. And the Catholic Church in itself, the word Catholic means universal. So they are all over the face of the earth, and they have millions of followers worldwide. But for us, being oral history cultures, when a place like this is lost, we lose entire chapters of our history. So we lose all of the stories associated. We lose the place. We lose the association to the songs and our ties to the landscape. And all of these places, the traditional cultural places, the sacred sites, they're all connected. So way back in the old days when we first started with Christmas lights, remember, if one Christmas light goes out, what happens to the rest of them? they all go out, right? So it's kind of the same thing with traditional cultural properties, in that when one site is lost, information that's vital to the people is lost with them. And all of the other sites that are included and associated are also diminished. So it makes it vitally important for us to do our very best to protect them. Next slide.
Yes, and so back to kind of just wanting to, I wanted to reiterate Angela's point that we really appreciate that the cattle ranchers or the cattle association is out there on the landscape, and what we're providing you will help us hopefully in protecting some of these sites. And so a lot of times consultation. So as Mary Ellen expressed early on, that there's a fear of kind of doing this process because it may shut down your project. And so for us, we get a lot of fear of people don't want to talk to us because they're afraid that we will stop their project or that there may be some issue with it. But we want to say that we want to start relationships. We want to have consultation. We want you to feel easy or at least good about coming and to talking to us. And so we see that as successful consultation. And we know that depends highly on communication. And so as an example, Mary Ellen, Shannon, and Kristen, we work with them. We see them at, I would say monthly at different meetings. We interact with them. They have concerns and they're contacting us constantly and work-related issues, but we know them a little bit personally and we hang out every now and then and do whatever. We've started those relationships. So it's important to develop relationships outside of consultation, just so we know we're aware of you, aware of what you do, and can work together successfully. So another example is that there are a lot of mine projects that are here in the community, and tribes more likely than not are heavily adverse to mine projects. But and so are we in a sense. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't consult with them. That doesn't mean we shouldn't talk with them to see, what they're doing and how they're doing it. And if there's an ability to avoid a significant site to us, sometimes they'll take that into consideration and try and work with us to see what we can do. So if you have that good relationship, there's an air of transparency. We'll be as transparent with you. And if you can be transparent with us, hopefully we can find a solution. And then also just that hopefully there's leadership participation. So one of the bad things about certain consultation is, as I mentioned, when we work with Mary Ellen, Shannon, and Kristen, we see them all the time, but they have bosses, we have bosses. And so when they have to run something up the chain of command, they may stop somewhere and they may say, well, we don't agree with what you're telling us and we don't want to go forward. So, they have the hard task of coming back to us saying, well, I ran it up my chain and, boss number 3 or 4 didn't agree. And so now, what we promised you, we can't really deliver. And so that's why it's important to establish the relationship, but then also to include your leadership, include those people further up that are decision makers and understanding what the tribes are requesting or what we're wanting to do. So that's there's just a picture of a infield site visit. I think that's I think they call it Indiana Ruin over that is I think owned by the University of Arizona. And so they gave us some paperwork, and that's Barnaby Lewis of the Gila Indian community. He's the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and he's asking TJ some questions. So we're learning about the site, and he gave us some paper. And so, we're having that communication. Next slide, please. Flexibility. So this is some key we want to make mention. As the ladies mentioned earlier, that they're trying to help you. Everybody's trying to get the project going. So to do that successfully, on our end, we have things that we have to do too. So if you can consult as far in advance as possible. So we always say, consult early, consult often. If you're just thinking about a project, and we might do this, you can call us up and say, this is something we're thinking about. It's going to be in this area. That's what I know so far. It gives us a heads up. And so we can kind of get our archaeologists, our people to say, well, you know, to work with you to say, well, these things might exist in that area. So we can help. Plan for alternatives. You know, the possibility that it might be a site or a sacred site, you may have to make some changes to protect some of the resources. And that's what the laws are there to exist for. They're there to protect the sites because they're important. Conduct site tours for the tribes. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of mine projects. So what we've requested from the mines is they talk to us in their jargon. And I am not I didn't go a miner. I didn't know a lot of stuff. They use a lot of technical jargon, but having worked with them, like I think the past 2-3 years, I've learned some things. They've told us how they extract the ore body. They let us know what certain things are done, why certain things are. There's some sites that there's only this particular ore body in the world, and that they have to mine that site because nowhere else in the world does it exist. So we learn a lot. So conduct site tours for us so we can learn about you, what you're going through, why you need to do your project, why you have to get it done. And, you know, we can kind of take that into consideration. We understand you have, you know, you're experts in your field as well. And so we want to learn a little bit about that. So again, be prepared to wait for responses. You know, you're busy, everybody's busy. We have that 30-day window. And so, you know, we want to make sure that a lot of times we'll get a question and they expect to answer by the end of the day. They might ask us in the morning and want a response by the end of the day. And that's just not possible. We have so many things to consider. Maybe something we've never faced before. We may have to get advice from elders in the community, or we may need to send it to our legal department or take it to council. There's a lot of hoops we may have to jump to just as well. Next slide, please. So if we're understanding and addressing the issues, you know, culture is paramount to us. We're losing it, you know, back when we were here and there was no contact, there were just Othan people and other tribes in the area. And then we got Spanish people coming in, then we have the European people coming in, and, you know, populations grow. I don't think they're decreasing. So a lot of space, area, and places that are important to us are now being used for other things. So culture is paramount to us. We want to try and protect what we can. And the cultural resources are irreplaceable as they capture a place in time and history. So much like a house fire, the house will burn and it can be rebuilt or it can be replaced, but the heirlooms and the things that were significant to you that are part of your family, those cannot. Those are irreplaceable. And so to some extent, it's mitigated. To another extent, you've lost something, you know, you've lost it. Also understand concurrence is not guaranteed. So there's a lot of things we won't agree to, like no matter how you present them to us, we just cannot concur with what you're putting forward. And that's just something that we want to tell everybody, because a lot of times they'll say, well, here's our project, here's what we're going to do, here's our plan, please concur. And they're expecting that we're just automatically going to concur. Sometimes we can't. We'll do our best to do what we can, but it's not always a guarantee. So understand that consultation is much more than a checkbox on a list. So we want to operate in good faith. That's part of the regulations, and at least in the federal statutes. But some agencies or some places just say, well, I talked to you, I consulted with you, I'm checking the box. And that's not really a thing if you're not listening to what I'm saying, or if you're not kind of taking into consideration what I'm suggesting. So mitigation does not equal excavation. So you're saying, you know, there's a nice Otham site here, and we're going to data recover everything, and we're going to map it, and we're going to put it in a book, and now we've done our part. So mitigation does not always equal excavation, and that doesn't make it great or better. So excavation is destruction, so it should be undertaken as a last resort. So we just wanted to make those things clear to you. I think that's what I had. Next slide. Is that it? Okay. Here's our contact information. But again, we just appreciate the time that you've given us to kind of express some of the things that are important to us and why we do what we do as well. And yeah, reach out to us. There's if you have a project or you just want to meet with us, we are busy people, so we'll get something on the schedule. But again, thank you for your time and attention.
And I think we're ready to take some questions from the audience. We have plenty of time. We're scheduled till 5, I understand, but I can stay as late as needed to answer questions.
Okay. So, well, I'm going to answer. I want something to be a little more addressed than it was from Shannon on the human remains, state land versus private lands. And I just wanted to be a little more explained that, you know, the way it was described, it's like, you know, you could go to jail or whatever if you find human remains and don't report it and stuff. But one thing that was always, I wanted to be explained more, like, could you possibly lose your private lands if you inadvertently get into say a burial ground, and they decide that it's that it should be taken away by eminent domain or something like that? Could you explain more on that? That's something a lot of people are afraid of. I know I grew up being afraid of that.
Really? Yeah, no,
Yeah.
nobody's going to take your private land away. All that people are, you know, these laws are built for are to ensure the respectful treatment of those remains as they are recovered from your property and repatriated elsewhere. I'm going to let Kristen chime in to provide more information.
Yeah, I just want to say first and foremost, I included that information not as something to scare people, but just to provide awareness, because a lot of private landowners in particular are not really aware of the fact that if human remains are encountered, that they even have a duty to report, or that they might be doing something that is against the law if they collect those remains and put them in a different location. And ultimately, as Shannon said, the goal of these statutes is just to ensure that any human remains that are encountered are able to be recovered and appropriately cared for as appropriate by the descendant community.
Thank you. And then Shane, is Shane still on?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. That last slide, I have to say, the last part of your slide, on your last slide, I was confused about what you were getting at there. On can you explain more? Yeah, excavation is destruction, so it should be undertaken as a last resort. And mitigation does not equal excavation. So are you saying that sometimes you will have to stop the excavation, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is more like when they're having like a major, like a federal courthouse, something like that. A lot of times the agency will want to just do excavation instead of like thinking about other alternatives. Like, you know, within any parcel of land, you know, you have some wiggle room if you're putting down a building that you can move it maybe 50 meters over, or, you know, something like that, where we're trying to find solutions that would preserve as much of the site as possible. And we know that's not possible all the time. We're not here to stand in the way of you know, progress or development, because we also depend on infrastructure and, you know, everything else. And so we totally understand that things have to be done. Our main focus is trying to destroy as little as possible, not only because it's best for us culturally, but also because it's really labor intensive and expensive to do excavation. So those are things that we also take into consideration. So when we're involved in an excavation, we don't want to see the site destroyed, but we will be there to repatriate any burials and funerary objects that might be found. So that's our main concern, that we recovered the people that may be buried there so that we can give them a proper and respectful burial elsewhere so they're not disturbed again. So that's our concern there.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, very much. Thank you. So we have Erica has the next question. Erica Fraley.
Hi, this is actually Abby, but I am on her account here today.
Oh, okay. Who is
So nice
it?
to meet you. That's Abby Lewis. So I was just wondering, just kind of piggybacking off of this last question, you know, what other, I'm curious as to what other steps or programs or outreach that is done just to, you know, keep the public aware about archaeological law in the state. So I'm curious about that.
There are conferences that we hold annually that are open to professionals as well as the public. That every couple of years we'll do a state act training or a federal section 106 training. This coming October, our conference will have Shannon's doing a session on the Antiquities Act and its rules, I believe. You have a session in there.
Yeah, it's not on the AAA this year.
Oh.
It's concurrent reviews with
Right,
various
yeah, right.
agencies.
We offer training to all the agencies that we work with because just because you're in a federal agency doesn't mean you understand what 106 process is. We are always available. I'm going to be going to Pinal County in a few weeks and doing a little bit of training on SHPO's roles and responsibilities there, not necessarily going into section 106, but addressing the full gamut of what SHPO does and why we do it. So there are general opportunities. I think we do need to do a little bit more on our website. We don't put them out there that often. So we can do that.
And I just want to add that for ASM, we have a lot of resources available on our webpage, including some presentations that are on YouTube and they're linked on our webpage. Occasionally we do some brown bags. However, most of the people that we attract are archaeological contractors. In addition, we also do a fair amount of outreach for different school programs and university students and Pima College students. But if anybody has an interest in learning more about what we do or the museum, we're always happy to provide a presentation. So feel free to reach out and we can figure out a way to accommodate your requests.
And as I said, I've already been to the Flagstaff meetings a couple times the last few years for NRCD, and I'm happy to go to meetings around the state anytime to meet people, discuss the projects, and discuss the kinds of equipment that's being used, to even discuss whether or not a survey is necessary, those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Okay, I see Bill J has his hand up. Do you have a question? Or now his hand's down, or?
No, I was on mute. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
Can you explain what some of the fees are and what are typical costs associated with going through the process?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button there. Yes, so the fees are related to the cost of basically for our time. So the things that are billed for are the time it takes to register a project in our system, the time it takes to review a report, review a potential, an archaeologist's qualifications for potential listing on a Arizona Antiquities Act permit, If archaeologists want copies of site cards and reports, our records office also conducts research for both archaeologists and non-archaeologists. The end result is different based on if they're a professional or not, but they do that for a fee. And we also offer other services such as human remains, documentation, and recovery. So those are some of the things that get billed. And we also charge the cost of curation. So whenever a project is registered with ASM, then the registrant is required to submit final reports to us. And if artifacts are being collected and our facility is the chosen curation place, then there will be a fee for those as well. And that simply is covering when something's curated, we take on an agreement to keep the object, report, photograph safe in a climate controlled environment from now until eternity. And so that does cost money.
SHPO does not charge for reviews.
And again, this is only because we don't get any state funding.
So is the fees, are they based on an hourly basis, or do you have an anticipated approximate cost of what an average
It is based on,
process is?
so we have hourly fees based on historical averages. So we track the amount of time it takes to do the things that we do and then review the amount of time in our estimated averages every 18 months or so to ensure that the costs are being consistent with the amount of time that we're spending. And if you are interested in getting an idea of the cost, the way services are initiated is through a quote request system. So on our website, there is a place where you can enter a quote request and put in the specific parameters to whatever it is you're going to be doing or needing from ASM. And then we will send you a quote, which is basically an estimate for the associated costs for that particular situation.
Okay, just to comment on that too, for those that, for agriculture and those that get grants through EQIP and stuff through NRCS, that came up with a few years ago with state land, Arizona state land. There was a problem with art clearances, and state land wouldn't pay the fees, the Arizona State Museum fees suddenly, and NRCS couldn't pay them. And but Keisha figured out the way to get around that was she's contracted with archaeological firms to get around that. So the archaeologists actually pay the fees to get around that. And so the ranchers aren't having to pay it. And so that's been working out for everybody. But that was a big problem a few years ago.
It's in the contracted cost that the consultant charges.
Right. Yeah. So that's been a way to get around it. And yes, so you guys, ranchers and farmers probably remember that being a problem a while ago, and that's Keisha's solved that. So do we have any more?
I was just going to add one more quick thing that Ian Milliken brought up in the comments. Thank you, Ian. That the curation costs are a small part of the overall cost of archaeological research. The field work itself costs money, and the cost of the field work is established by whatever archaeological firm is conducting the work. And so that varies company to company based on whatever their fee structure is.
Hopefully they're making assumptions that if there's a negative survey, they can use a streamlined report. Therefore, they don't have to write a full-blown report, which costs more money.
Right,
So
that's why we have things like that in line to save everybody time and money.
Okay.
Tina, this is Deborah. The only other comment I wanted to add is that as you mentioned, Ms. Keisha, the Arizona NRCS state conservationist had, contracted out. And so that helped with the fees for those individuals, but that's only for individuals that are using equip. Private landowners or private landowners with state leases that are paying for their own improvements are still required to pay for that themselves. They have to pay for the
Correct.
ARC survey and the fees themselves. And so unfortunately, it didn't help solve it for those individuals. But
Right, there's no way around that.
there is no way around that, unfortunately, at this time. We're hoping in the future to work on something at the state legislature to help that situation. But anyway, but thank you.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Oh, okay, no. I guess you all explained things so well that we don't even have any questions. We thought we would have a lot more, so.
We'll just reiterate that, for SHPO, we're here to answer your questions all the time. We have information, we're under state parks, AZ SHPO at AZ state, under state parks. So you can find us on the website there. We're always available to come out and meet with you or answer questions. Don't let anything that you hear make you fearful of talking with us. We are not going to stop your project. We just will try to get all the information we need to better assess where we think we can help.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time to explain that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also add, if anybody has questions pop up after this is done, you can reach out to any of us and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Yeah, and in case somebody didn't see my message on the chat, we did record this. We had requests to record it because some people weren't going to be able to make this time. So, and we are going to post it on our AACD website, which is aacd1944.com. So it won't come up till tomorrow. So you won't be able to get to it till tomorrow, but you will be able to view it later if you want to review something later on that.
And it will be listed in our library.
Oh yeah, it's gonna, be under the library link. Thank you, Deborah. All right. Thank you everyone for participating. Very informative, and thank you Shane and Kristen and what was it? Angela. Yes, very informative. I really appreciate you guys getting on. You gave us all a good perspective up from your side of it. I appreciate that. And thank you all for joining us.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having us.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the presenters. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.